What would you do if a police officer wrongfully accused your child of a crime she didn't commit? How would you react if that same officer, full of prejudice, realized too late that he had made the biggest mistake of his life? Can you even imagine the impact that could have on a family, on a community? In the small town of Alderwood, Missouri, a young black girl finds herself arrested by a cop who is convinced of her guilt, simply because of how she looks. But when the truth unfolds, it sends the officer down a path he never saw coming. A journey that forces him to confront everything he thought he knew about justice, community, and most shockingly himself. What happens next will leave you questioning the very way we perceive one another, and how far someone can go to make things right. Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, so you never miss an update on our latest content. The sun was sinking low behind the line of trees that lined Broad Street, casting long shadows across the sleepy streets of Alderwood. The peaceful quiet of the town was broken only by the hum of streetlights flickering to life, signaling the start of another uneventful shift for Officer Jake Hardin. Sitting behind the wheel of his patrol car, one hand firmly gripping the steering wheel, the other tapping restlessly on the edge of his radio, he felt the familiar sense of control that came with patrolling these streets. This was his domain. This town needed him, needed someone like him, thorough, firm, unbending. He was the protector, the enforcer. As he passed the local convenience store, a small figure caught his eye. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9, sitting alone on a bench outside. Her legs swung nervously back and forth as she nibbled on a small pack of crackers. Her pink dress, slightly worn, was the only sign that this was a child far from home. Her dark curls were tied neatly back, but her eyes told a different story. She looked nervous, constantly glancing around, as if she didn't belong there. Something didn't sit right with Jake. He slowed the car and parked across the street, watching, waiting. A child alone near a store. What if she'd taken something without paying? He had seen it all too often. Kids getting into trouble, no parents in sight. Duty called as it always did. Without hesitation, he opened the door, his boots hitting the pavement with a solid, determined thud. His pace was measured, purposeful, as he walked toward the little girl, her nervous gaze lifting to meet his as his shadow stretched across her. "Hey there." Jake's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "Where are your parents?" The girl swallowed, clutching the crackers tighter, her voice soft, barely a whisper. "My mom's inside. She said I could wait here." Jake's eyes scanned the store behind her, where the evening rush was in full swing. No sign of the mother. His eyes flicked to the crackers. "Did you pay for those?" he asked, his suspicion rising. The girl's eyes widened in surprise. "My mom gave them to me. I didn't take anything, I promise." But Jake's suspicion deepened. Something wasn't right. The way she looked back at the store, waiting, anxious. He crossed his arms over his chest and leaned down to her level, his tone sharp. "Let's be honest here," he said. "Did you take them from the store without paying?" The girl's lips trembled, her eyes welling up. "No, sir," she whispered, shaking her head desperately. But Jake had already made up his mind. Without a word, he grabbed her arm, pulling her up from the bench. "Come on," he barked. "We'll wait for your mom inside." Tears streamed down the little girl's face as her small body shook with fear. "Please, I didn't do anything wrong," she sobbed. "My mom's coming back. I promise." But Jake wasn't listening. His job wasn't about second-guessing. It was about enforcing the rules. He led her toward the store, his grip firm, his face set in stone, ignoring the curious, concerned looks from the growing crowd around them. Inside the store, the atmosphere was chaotic, the hum of voices blending with the beeping of registers and clattering carts. Caroline Grant, her mind preoccupied with dinner plans and work emails, had no idea what was coming. Then a commotion at the entrance caught her attention. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw Jake, holding Mia by the arm, walking her through the door. Her heart dropped. "Mia!" Caroline rushed toward them, her arms outstretched. The moment she reached her daughter, Mia collapsed into her arms, crying hysterically. "Mommy, I didn't do anything. The man thinks I stole the crackers." Caroline stood up, fury flashing in her eyes as she turned toward Jake. "She didn't steal anything," she snapped. "I gave her those crackers. What do you think you're doing?" Jake's voice was cold, unwavering. I saw a child alone outside, acting suspicious. It's my job to investigate. Suspicious? Caroline's voice shook with rage. She's a child. A scared little girl just waiting for her mother. What's suspicious about that? The crowd had gathered by now, murmuring, some pulling out their phones to record the confrontation. Jake could feel their judgment weighing on him, but he refused to back down. I'm just doing my job, he insisted. I'm trying to keep this community safe. Safe? Caroline's voice cracked with disbelief. By treating innocent children like criminals? A tense silence fell, broken only by the whispers of the crowd. Jake hesitated for a brief moment. Could he really be wrong? Was this more than just protocol? Before he could find an answer, a voice from the crowd broke the silence. Let the kid go. The store manager arrived, followed by employees, and Jake felt their eyes on him, the pressure mounting. For the first time, doubt crept in. Maybe he had overstepped. Maybe Mia was just a child. His instincts hadn't been as spot on as he'd thought. Caroline, seething with fury, turned to leave, holding Mia close. I'm filing a formal complaint, she said coldly. This is unacceptable. Jake, his jaw clenched, could only watch as they walked out of the store, leaving him behind in the chaos of his own making. Days passed, but the guilt gnawed at Jake. The image of Mia's tear-streaked face haunted him. When the complaint reached the police chief, Jake found himself sitting in an office, facing the sharp gaze of his superior. Jake, the chief said, disappointment thick in his voice. We've had a formal complaint filed. Racial profiling. A little girl. Jake felt a cold sweat forming. He hadn't thought about it like that. It wasn't about race, was it? But the chief wasn't buying his excuses. You're suspended until further notice, the chief continued. There's an investigation underway. As Jake sat in that sterile office, he realized something. The badge, the power it once gave him, now felt like a weight he could barely carry. The sensitivity training, at first something he thought he could breeze through, became a turning point. The stories, the examples, the voices of people who had faced injustice. It all started to hit too close to home. What if he had been wrong about Mia? What if his instincts weren't as reliable as he had always believed? By the time the training was over, Jake wasn't the same man who had walked in. He had been forced to confront something ugly inside himself. But it didn't end there. As part of his suspension, Jake was sent to volunteer at a local community center. Uncomfortable, out of place, he showed up, wearing civilian clothes, expecting to just do his time. And then there she was, Caroline. And Mia. Jake's heart sank. Caroline's gaze was filled with anger and distrust, and Mia, with her shy smile, was helping serve food. The message was clear. Jake wasn't welcome here. But he didn't give up. Day after day, he returned, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he could show the town, and himself, that he wasn't the man they thought he was. And slowly, he started to see things differently. The struggles of the families, the challenges they faced every day, the quiet dignity they carried. Jake began to understand at last what he had been blind to all along. One afternoon, while stacking boxes at the food bank, he overheard a conversation between two volunteers. The words that followed would challenge everything he had ever known. Would he finally understand? Could he ever make it right? Caroline and Mia had been helping at the community center for years. One of them, Caroline, had started right after her mom passed away. It had been a way to give back, to heal. Mia, always by her side, was a kid who seemed to glow with kindness and intelligence. Jake couldn't shake the image of her. Her innocence, her warmth, her openness. And yet, Jake had frozen when he first saw her. The same little girl he had accused of theft. The very same child he had handcuffed, assuming she was guilty without a second thought. She wasn't a criminal. No. Mia was a regular volunteer at the food bank, helping those in need. A punch of realization hit him right in the gut. The depth of his mistake crashed over him, and his hands trembled as he placed the box down on the counter. How could he have been so wrong? As the memory of his earlier conversation replayed in his mind, a sickening wave of guilt washed over him. Caroline and Mia weren't strangers passing through town. They were cornerstones of the community, working tirelessly to help others. And Mia, that sweet, trusting child? How could he have been so blind? He had treated her like a criminal, when she was the farthest thing from it. Jake's stomach churned as he thought of how many others he had misjudged. How many people had he wrongly assumed the worst of, just because of his own biases and assumptions? That night, Jake sat alone in his apartment. The dim light from the street lamp barely cut through the darkness of the room. His thoughts were racing. Was he really the protector he had always thought he was? He had patrolled the streets, believing that his job was to keep order, to separate the good from the bad. But now, after everything with Mia, he questioned everything. Life was not so black and white. People weren't just problems to be fixed or threats to be neutralized. They were people, complicated, multifaceted, and human, something he had failed to see all these years. Unable to sit with his thoughts any longer, Jake abruptly stood. His chair scraped against the floor, and he couldn't just stay there, trapped in his own mind. He had to do something, anything to change this. The next day, he returned to the community center. He didn't know what to expect. He hadn't seen Caroline or Mia since overhearing their conversation, and part of him hoped they wouldn't be there. But when he walked in, there they were, standing behind the counter, dishing out food with smiles on their faces. The knot of guilt in Jake's chest tightened, but he knew he couldn't hide from this. He had to face the consequences of his actions. With determination, he grabbed a broom and started sweeping the floor in the back, keeping his head down. His plan was simple. Stay out of sight, keep working, and try to make up for his mistake. But as he swept, his eyes kept flicking up, drawn to Caroline and Mia, their effortless teamwork, the joy in Mia's face when she made someone smile. It wasn't just charity for them. It was a way of life, a way of giving back. Jake's mind raced. How could he make things right? An apology seemed so small too late. But what else could he do? Before he could answer his own question, Caroline approached him. She was calm, but there was a quiet firmness in her voice. "Officer Hardin," she said. "Can we talk?" Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he nodded. He followed her to a small room at the back of the center, away from the hustle and bustle of the main area. As the door closed behind them, Caroline crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "I know why you're here," she said, her voice calm. "You're trying to make up for what you did to Mia. And I appreciate that. But I need to hear it from you. Do you understand what you did wrong?" Jake's breath caught. Her words felt like a weight on his chest. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. I made assumptions," he began, his voice shaking. "I saw Mia sitting alone, and I jumped to conclusions. I thought she was up to no good. I didn't listen to her when she tried to explain. I let my own biases cloud my judgment. I hurt her. I hurt both of you." Caroline didn't interrupt. She simply waited. Jake continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I was wrong, Caroline. So wrong. And I know saying sorry doesn't fix what I did. But I am sorry. I've thought about it every day since it happened. I need you to know. I'm going to do better. I don't want to be that kind of officer. I don't want to be that kind of person." The room was silent for a long moment, Jake standing there, his heart in his throat, waiting for her response. Finally, Caroline spoke, her voice softer but still steady. "I appreciate your honesty," she said. "But it's not me you owe an apology to. It's Mia." Jake nodded, his heart sinking. "I know," he said, swallowing hard. "And I will apologize to her. But, what can I do? How can I make things right?" Caroline's gaze softened, though her expression remained serious. "Actions speak louder than words," she said. "You want to make things right? Prove it. Show us you've changed. Keep showing up. Keep doing the work." Jake felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt. He hadn't expected forgiveness. He didn't deserve it. But the fact that Caroline was willing to give him a chance to prove himself felt like a lifeline. Over the next few weeks, Jake threw himself into helping at the community center. He worked quietly, staying out of the way, but always watching, always learning. He didn't speak to Mia directly, not yet, but he was determined to earn her trust. As the days turned into weeks, Jake began to notice something. A change in the way people treated him. At first, there were wary glances and whispers when he entered the room. But over time, those glances softened, the whispers faded. People started greeting him with nods, even stopping to chat as he worked. One afternoon, as Jake restocked shelves in the pantry, Mia approached him, her hands clasped behind her back. His heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment he had been both dreading and hoping for. "Hi, Mia," Jake said, his voice gentle. She shifted from foot to foot, her gaze flickering between Jake and the floor. Mom said you're here to help, Mia said, her voice soft. Jake nodded. That's right. I'm here to help. Mia hesitated, then looked up at him with those wide, innocent eyes that had haunted him for so long. Are you really sorry for what you did? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's chest tightened with emotion. He nodded, his voice thick with guilt. Yes, Mia. I'm really sorry. I didn't listen to you when I should have. And I didn't treat you the way you deserved. I'm sorry. Mia stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she nodded. Okay, she said softly. I forgive you. Jake blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't expected forgiveness, especially not from Mia. But when she said those words, a weight lifted off his shoulders. A weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Thank you, Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Mia smiled, then skipped back to Caroline. Jake watched her go, a strange sense of peace settling over him. He knew he still had a long way to go. But in that moment, he had taken the first step toward making things right. Jake's journey didn't end there. As he continued to volunteer, he became more involved in the lives of the people he served. He listened. He learned. And little by little, he saw the world through their eyes, realizing just how much he had missed over the years. One day, while organizing a food drive, Caroline approached him with a clipboard. Officer Hardin, she said, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. I think it's time we take this to the next level. Jake raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. What do you mean? We're planning a community outreach event, Caroline explained. We want to bring people together, residents, police officers, everyone. It's about building bridges, about showing that we're all on the same side. And we'd like you to help us organize it. Jake stared at the clipboard, disbelief flooding through him. Me, he asked, his voice tinged with surprise. You want me to help? Caroline nodded. You've been doing the work, Officer Hardin. You've shown us you're serious about making things right. Now it's time to take the next step. Jake's heart swelled with pride and gratitude. This wasn't just about making amends. It was an opportunity to make a real difference. He smiled, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. I'm in, he said, his voice steady. Let's do this. The event was a success far beyond Jake's expectations. People who had once viewed him with suspicion were now engaging with him, trusting him. And as the day came to a close, Jake stood in the park, watching Mia at the front of the dunk tank line, a mischievous grin on her face. He couldn't help but smile. This was what it was all about. Bringing people together, building trust, and showing that they were all part of the same community. As the sun set, laughter echoed across the park. The community picnic had been a resounding success. And for the first time in a long while, Jake felt like he truly belonged. The tension that had once hung in the air was gone, vanished like a storm cloud after a summer rain. Mia, her curly hair bouncing with every step, sprinted toward Jake with a grin so wide it seemed to light up the entire park. Her joy was palpable, infectious even, and it swept over him like a wave. For a fleeting moment, Jake's heart swelled with a mixture of pride, relief, and something deeper, something more raw. After everything they'd been through, after all the mistakes, this moment, that connection, was what truly mattered. You did it. Mia's voice bubbled with excitement. You really helped put all this together. Jake couldn't help but chuckle, shaking his head, caught in the whirlwind of her enthusiasm. Nah, kid, I just helped. It was your mom and all these other folks who made it happen. Mia's grin stretched even wider as she wiped the sweat from her brow, catching her breath. But you're part of it too, she said, her eyes bright with admiration. That's what Mom says. She says you've been doing a really good job. Jake's smile faltered just a bit, a quick flash of doubt passing through him. He looked down at the girl who had once been terrified of him, the same girl who, after all the hurt he had caused, had forgiven him, had shown him kindness when he thought he didn't deserve it. It hadn't been that long ago that he had misjudged her so badly, and now here she was, not just forgiving him, but celebrating with him. Thanks, Mia, Jake said softly, bending down to meet her eye level. That means more than you know. Mia giggled, the last of her exhaustion replaced with a renewed burst of energy. Come on, Jake, I want to show you the face painting booth. Mom's over there with the other volunteers. Jake straightened, brushing the grass off his knees as Mia grabbed his hand, leading him across the park. With every step, Jake felt the distance between him and his past grow wider, as if the path ahead was a new beginning. As they neared the face-painting booth, Jake's gaze shifted, drawn to Caroline, who was deep in conversation with some of the other mothers. Her face radiated satisfaction, the kind that comes only from knowing a job has been well done. The moment their eyes met, Caroline waved them over with a playful grin. "You're just in time," she said, her tone teasing. "I was about to volunteer you for the dunk tank again." Jake laughed, shaking his head. "I think I've been dunked enough times for one day. But if it makes the kids happy, I'll do it again." Caroline raised an eyebrow, her laugh ringing out. "Don't tempt them. They'll take you up on that offer in a heartbeat." For a moment, the two of them stood there, watching as Mia ran off to join her friends. Neither of them spoke at first. The air between them had shifted, no longer charged with the tension and resentment that had once defined their interactions. Now there was a quiet understanding, a shared sense of purpose. "I didn't think I'd ever see a day like this," Caroline said softly, her eyes scanning the bustling crowd. "It's been a long time coming." Jake nodded, his mind drifting back to the painful road they'd traveled to get here. All the mistakes he'd made, the biases he had held, the work he had put in to try and make things right. It hadn't been easy. But now here they were. "It has," he said quietly, his voice steady. "But we're here now. That's what matters." Caroline glanced at him, her expression thoughtful, as if weighing her words carefully. "You've changed, Jake." Jake's heart skipped a beat at her words. Was it possible that she was seeing him, truly seeing him, for who he was becoming? "I didn't believe it at first," Caroline continued. "I thought you were just trying to save face, maybe hoping we'd forget what happened. But I see it now. You're not the same man who put my daughter in handcuffs." Jake swallowed, his throat tight as her words settled into him, heavy but somehow freeing. He wasn't that man anymore. At least, he didn't want to be. "I'm not," he said quietly. "Or at least, I don't want to be. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. More than I care to admit. But what happened with Mia? That was a wake-up call. I needed to face some hard truths about myself. And I'm still learning. I'll probably be learning for the rest of my life." Caroline smiled faintly, her eyes softening with understanding. "We all are. None of us have it all figured out. But what matters is that you're trying. You're showing up day after day. And that means something." Jake felt something stir inside him, a mixture of gratitude and awe. He wasn't used to receiving praise, especially not from someone he had hurt so deeply. But hearing those words from Caroline, someone who had every right to despise him, meant more than he could ever put into words. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot coming from you." Caroline nodded, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer, before she turned her attention back to the picnic. "You know," she said after a brief pause, "there's something I've been meaning to talk to you about." Jake raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "What's that?" Caroline hesitated for a moment, her fingers drumming gently on the picnic table, as if weighing her words. "The food bank," she said, her voice serious now. "We've been running it for years, but we're starting to get overwhelmed. The need in this community is growing, and we're struggling to keep up. I was wondering if you'd be interested in helping out more regularly? Not just volunteering here and there, but really stepping up. We could use someone like you, someone who knows this community and cares about it." Jake blinked, taken aback by the offer. He had never thought of himself as someone who could truly make a difference in the community. His job had always been about law and order, about keeping the peace. But now, standing here, surrounded by people he had come to care about, he realized that there was more to being an officer, more to being a member of this town, than just enforcing the rules. "I'd be honored," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever you need, I'm there." Caroline's eyes softened with a genuine warmth. "Good. We could use someone with your skills. And your heart." For the first time in a long while, Jake felt a surge of pride at her words. He felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, something that truly mattered. And as the weeks passed, his role in the community grew. He wasn't just Officer Hardin anymore, the stern cop patrolling the streets. He was Jake, the man working to heal the wounds he had caused and build trust in a community that had once feared him. At the station, the word had spread. At first, some of his fellow officers were skeptical, but soon, even the most doubtful among them started to see the change. One afternoon, as Jake was finishing up a shift at the food bank, Officer Maya Rodriguez approached him with a playful smirk on her face. "I've got to hand it to you, Jake," she said, her voice teasing but not unkind. "I didn't think you had it in you." Jake chuckled, raising an eyebrow. "Had what in me?" "The whole community outreach thing," Maya replied, leaning against the doorway. "You were always the by-the-book guy. I didn't think you'd be the type to roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty." Jake shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "People can surprise you." Maya laughed, shaking her head. "Yeah, you're full of surprises lately. But I'll admit it's working. You've got some of the other guys talking about getting involved. Maybe you're onto something." Jake nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't about proving anything to his fellow officers. It was about doing what was right. But if his actions could inspire others to think differently, to approach their work with more empathy, then that was a win. "Thanks, Maya," Jake said sincerely. "But this isn't about me. It's about the people we're supposed to serve." Maya's smirk softened into a smile, genuine and approving. "I hear you. And I respect that. Keep it up, Jake. The station could use more people like you." As Maya turned to leave, Jake stood there for a moment, reflecting on how far he had come. A few months ago, he would never have imagined being in this position, respected, not just for his ability to enforce the law, but for his commitment to the community. It was a humbling realization, and one that filled him with a deep sense of purpose. The following week, Caroline and Mia invited Jake over for dinner. It was a quiet Sunday evening, and the air was crisp with the first hints of autumn settling over Alderwood. Jake arrived at their house, his stomach filled with a mix of nerves and gratitude. He hadn't expected to be welcomed into their home, not after everything that had happened. But here he was, standing on their doorstep, about to cross a threshold that meant more than just sharing a meal. Caroline opened the door, her warm smile putting him at ease. "Come on in," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "Dinner's almost ready." Jake stepped inside, taking in the cozy, lived-in feel of the house. The smell of home-cooked food filled the air, and he could hear Mia's giggles from another room, her laughter sweet and carefree. "You've got a nice place," Jake said, glancing around. Caroline smiled, a touch of pride in her eyes. "Thanks. It's home." As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed easily. Mia chattered excitedly about school, sharing stories about her favorite subjects and the new friends she'd made. Caroline talked about her work at the food bank, and Jake listened, feeling more connected to them with every passing minute. But then, as they finished dessert, Caroline's expression shifted, becoming more thoughtful. "You know," she said softly, "I've been thinking about that day at the store. About how everything could have turned out so differently." Jake's stomach tightened at the mention of that day, but he didn't interrupt. He owed her that much. "I was so angry at you," Caroline continued, her voice steady but tinged with the rawness of the past. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to forgive you for what you did to Mia. And part of me still holds on to that anger. If I'm being honest." Jake nodded, understanding. He knew that her anger was justified, that it wasn't something that would disappear overnight. But then Caroline said, her gaze meeting his, "I see you here. I see the work you've done, the way you've committed yourself to this community. And I realize that people can change. You've shown us that." Jake swallowed hard, his throat thick with emotion. "I don't know if I deserve your forgiveness," he said quietly, "but I'm going to keep trying to earn it." Caroline smiled, a small, gentle smile that carried more weight than words could express. "You already have, Jake. You already have." As the weeks stretched into months, Jake's role in the community continued to evolve. He became a familiar face at the food bank, the park, and local events. People who had once avoided him now greeted him warmly. Kids who had once seen him as a figure of authority now saw him as someone they could trust. But the most significant change was within Jake himself. He had learned to listen, to really listen, to the people around him, to understand their fears, their struggles, their hopes. One day, as Jake walked through the town square, He overheard a conversation between two teenagers sitting on a bench. They were talking about the upcoming community cleanup event, an initiative Jake had helped organize with the local youth. "That Officer Harden guy," one of the teens said. "He's actually pretty cool. My little brother got sick, and he dropped off food for us last week. Can you believe that?" The other teen nodded. Yeah, Jake had always believed in the power of second chances. But it wasn't until he truly experienced it for himself that he understood just how transformative it could be. What started as an attempt to rebuild something, a community that thrived on trust and mutual support, had turned into something far deeper than he'd ever expected. It wasn't just about helping others anymore. It was about learning to see the world through different eyes. The seasons had changed, but Jake's transformation had been far more profound than the shifting weather. It wasn't the passing days, or the tasks he took on at the food bank, that marked the change within him. No, it was something far more subtle, something that spoke volumes in a way words never could. It was the look in people's eyes. The way they greeted him, no longer with fear or mistrust but with warmth, with genuine smiles. And then there was Mia. Oh, Mia. Every time she smiled at him, something in his chest tightened. Her smile had become the most honest reflection of how far he'd come, and it was a barometer that told him he was on the right path. But deep down, he knew he hadn't fully arrived yet. Trust, after all, was fragile. It was a delicate thing, and the weight of his past mistakes would always hang over him like a shadow. But with every passing day, he felt more connected to Alderwood, more in tune with its heartbeat than he ever had before. The badge on his chest, once a symbol of authority and enforcement, now felt like something entirely different, something much more profound. It was a symbol of responsibility, a responsibility he would never again take lightly. The community outreach program had grown far beyond his expectations. What began as a small food drive had blossomed into something far larger. Monthly events, cleanup projects, mentoring sessions for local kids, workshops where residents and officers alike could come together, engage, and talk openly. The walls that had once divided them, the tension that had simmered beneath the surface, had begun to crumble. Little by little, Alderwood was becoming a place where people truly looked out for one another. One afternoon, as Jake was packing up after a youth workshop, he spotted Officer Tom Landry across the park. Tom, once so resistant to change, was now standing in the middle of a circle of teenagers, listening to their stories, offering advice. Jake couldn't help but smile. He remembered when Tom had scoffed at the idea of community policing. Soft policing, he called it. But now, here he was fully immersed in the very thing he'd once dismissed. "Hey, Harden," Tom called out, waving him over with a surprisingly light tone. "Come meet these kids. They've got some great ideas for the next cleanup." Jake strolled over, marveling at the change in Tom, in himself, in everything. It was hard to believe how far they had all come. Officer Jake, Corey, a lanky teen with a backward baseball cap, grinned at him, offering a mock salute. "We were just telling Officer Landry, we're thinking of organizing a basketball tournament next month. Want to join us? You in?" Jake chuckled, throwing a playful look toward Corey. "As long as you go easy on us old guys." Corey laughed, but there was no edge to it, no sarcasm. Just pure camaraderie. "Nah, we're taking you down." And just like that, the banter flowed natural, easy, genuine. The tension, the walls, the barriers that had once kept him separated from these kids, from the community, seemed to evaporate. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was progress. And that, Jake realized, was what mattered most. Later that night, as the quiet of the evening settled over him, Jake sat on his porch, contemplating the journey he had been on. He wasn't the same man who had once pulled Mia from that bench outside the store, certain she was up to no good. No, he had been forced to confront his own demons, to challenge the narrow views he'd once held. It hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. And it had changed him. Jake's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a message from Caroline. "Hey Jake, I wanted to thank you again for everything today. The kids really look up to you, and I know Mia does too. I don't think I've ever told you this, but she wants to be a police officer when she grows up. She says she wants to help people the way you do." Jake's heart swelled. "Mia, The very same girl he had once made so afraid of him, wanted to follow in his footsteps? His fingers trembled as he typed a response. Thanks, Caroline. That means more to me than you know. Mia's incredible. She's going to do great things, no matter what she decides to do. The reply came quickly. She's lucky to have someone like you in her life, Jake. We all are. Jake stared at the words, letting them sink in. He had spent so long trying to prove himself, trying to make amends for the mistakes he had made. But in that moment he realized something. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. He had already earned their trust. He had already shown them who he truly was. And for the first time in a long while, Jake allowed himself to feel something he had long buried: pride. Weeks later, the biggest event Alderwood had ever seen took place. A block party that spanned entire streets, drawing hundreds of residents together. Music, food, games, and most importantly, a real sense of unity between the police and the community they served. Jake stood near one of the food stands, watching as families mingled with officers, laughing, talking, as if the walls between them had never existed. He spotted Tom, now tossing a football with some kids. Maya Rodriguez was helping a group of teenagers paint a mural. Everywhere Jake looked, he saw connection, understanding, hope. As Jake made his way through the crowd, exchanging smiles and handshakes, he saw Mia near the dunk tank, grinning at him. Jake, she called out, her voice bubbling with excitement. You've got to get in the dunk tank again. Everyone's waiting to dunk you. Jake held up his hands in mock protest. Again? I've already been dunked 3 times today. Mia's grin widened. One more time. Come on, it's for charity. Jake sighed dramatically, but truthfully, he didn't mind at all. This was what it was all about. Being part of something bigger than himself. Showing up for the people who needed him, proving to them, and to himself, that he wasn't just Officer Harden anymore. He was Jake, their neighbor, their friend. As he climbed into the dunk tank, he saw Caroline standing nearby, smiling. She gave him a thumbs up. Jake couldn't help but smile back. All right, Mia, he called out. Let's see what you've got. Mia stepped up, winding up her arm. She threw the ball with precision, and with a loud splash, Jake was plunged into the cold water. The crowd erupted in laughter and cheers. As Jake climbed out, dripping wet but grinning from ear to ear, something shifted inside him. The guilt, the shame, the weight of his past mistakes, they didn't disappear, but they didn't control him anymore. He had faced them. He had owned them. And in doing so, he had found something he hadn't realized he was missing, a sense of belonging. As the sun set, casting a warm golden light over the streets, Jake stood at the edge of the park, gazing out over Alderwood. This place, with all its struggles, had become his home. His true home. He wasn't just part of the police force anymore. He was part of the very fabric of this community. Mia slipped her hand into his, and he looked down to see her wide eyes, full of admiration. You did good today, Jake, she said quietly, sincerely. Jake squeezed her hand. So did you, kiddo. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt at peace. The past was no longer a burden. It was a reminder of how far he had come, of the lessons he had learned, and of the power of second chances.